ask Father Daniel to, we'll ask Father Daniel to open us in prayer.
Happy to, Bob. And thank you, Peter, for agreeing to speak to all of our men this evening. It's no coincidence that we are actually having this conference also at the beginning of Advent, in which we prepare for the coming of the Prince of Peace. And we know that the Lord himself is a bit torn by all that is going on in his homeland. And so we pray and ask the Lord's intercession in a special way for the peoples there to be able to find a way forward towards a lasting peace, which we know comes ultimately only through forgiveness and through the message of the Messiah. So I'd invite you all, those of you who are Lumen members, I'll lead us through the Lumen Leadership Prayer. If you have a copy, it's a beautiful prayer, and I think it's very apropos for our conference tonight. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Jesus, Lord and Master, you are wise and good, the greatest of leaders. In your wisdom, you have given me power to influence others. Help me to use it well today, not for my glory, but for yours, not for my good, but for theirs, not for pleasure, but for justice, not for money, but for true wealth. For I know that when my life is over, all that will last is what I achieved for you and for my neighbor. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Thank you, Father Daniel. BJ, we'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, so thank you. I wish I could call Peter like an everyday talk to kind of friend, but I have heard Peter speak on topics related to the Middle East at least 3, if not 4 times. He's been very gracious with his time. He's from my alma mater, so it means a lot to me that Boston College is showing well here tonight. Peter's an associate professor of political science at BC and a research affiliate with the MIT Security Studies program. His research focuses on Middle East politics and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, terrorism, political violence, nationalism, rebels and revolution, and peace building. So it's a pretty wide range of things that are all really happening concurrently in the Middle East right now. So such a timely topic. So Professor Krause, we are so honored to have you. Thank you so much for your time, and we're really interested to hear what you have to say. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, BJ. It's an honor to be here. And yes, as you say, I was trying to remember, but I've definitely spoken with the Lumen Group a few times, and always an honor to do so. I think your mission is fantastic. So thank you to BJ and to Bob. Thank you to the Father for the great prayer at the beginning. And yeah, just to say a little my background beyond this, as Bob was mentioning before, I just became a new father, if you can believe it, on October 7th. So literally, my son was born, my first child, the same morning I'm getting text about, the terrible Hamas attack that happened. And so for these past 2 months, it's been quite a whirlwind, both personally and professionally, as well as the fact that I work over the past 3 summers in particular with an organization that supports Israeli and Palestinian entrepreneurs. It's actually one of the only ones that actually has Palestinians from Gaza who come and are part of it. So it has 20 and 30-year-old Israeli and Palestinians who create these organizations. And I'm kind of brought in as the person who gives background and historical context to teach them about each other's history and go through some of the different difficult elephants in the room. The great thing about it is you see the future leaders of these societies, and it gives me hope even in these times now where there's seemingly the least hope in my past 20 years that I've studied this conflict in terms of what's going on. The challenge is, of course, I have friends and close to family in all these various areas where this is happening. And so it's incredibly difficult to watch this. And for those of you who also are parents, I'll tell you that the past 2 months, seeing things about, the Israeli children who were kidnapped or killed in the Hamas attacks and the Palestinian children who have been killed in some of the subsequent bombings, it just hits differently. And it's tough to study this stuff and to talk about it. And so if you've been emotional watching some of this, just understand that I have as well. Nonetheless, I think it's important for all of us to try to understand, why did this happen? What are the various perspectives on the conflict that are going on right now? What is U.S. policy here? What might come next? That's what I'm going to focus on today. So as BJ mentioned, I'm teaching 2 classes at BC right now, International Relations in the Middle East, which has a 1-month set on Arab-Israeli conflict, and then terrorism and political violence. So every day, and I go back to class again tomorrow, this is the last week of classes, I talk about all this stuff in great depth. We obviously don't have a full semester tonight, I'm doing a mini course at MIT now for the whole faculty and MIT alumni community that's lasting about 6 hours. We don't have that long. We've got about 30 to 40 minutes. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to focus for you on why October 7th happened, what the Hamas's strategy was for this attack, what Israeli strategy and perspectives have been both before and after October 7th, what U.S. policy is ongoing during the conflict, and how President Biden is dealing with a split to some extent in the Democratic Party over this stuff. And I'm going to talk to you about what might happen next in Gaza and the various tactics and potential goals that the Israelis and others may have for the territory. So we'll cover all of that. But if you also in the Q&A want to talk about the history of Zionism and Palestinian nationalism or other precedents, I'm happy to do so. It's just in the time I have, these are the things that I think I can cover in at least some decent detail and give you some interesting insights that we can chew on during the discussion. So I have some slides here I'm going to show you alongside, which I think will help. Just give me a thumbs up. Can you see my slides and me okay? Okay, excellent. So again, these are the 4 things that I'm going to cover in the next 30 to 40 minutes. So just as a reminder, again, in terms of the context of this, the attacks that happened on October 7th were the deadliest day in Israel's history. It's the most Jews that have been killed on a single incident since the Holocaust. So obviously incredibly deadly in that regard, and something that weighs heavily not just on Israelis, but more broadly. And so we want to understand kind of why this happened. So let's start with this question about why did Hamas attack on October 7th? And what was or is their strategy? And I understand in these contexts, it can be tough to talk about strategy because you can just look at this and say, lots of aspects of this just seem evil. You're targeting or killing civilians, etc. But it doesn't mean there's not some strategic thinking by the group, even if it fails or even if it's, morally depraved in that broader sense. So one of the things you hear about in the news is the idea that Hamas strategy was launched to do what we in political science called spoiling. Spoiling is when a group uses violence to try to basically drive a wedge of mistrust between parties that are negotiating. And in this sense, Hamas is not new to this strategy. In the 1990s, when you had leaders of the Palestinian national movement under Yasser Arafat negotiating with Yitzhak Rabin, the prime minister of Israel, Hamas was one of the biggest parties that did not want that negotiation to go through. And so they launched a series of suicide bombings and other attacks inside of Israel to make it so those negotiations didn't get as far as they could have. So many people have argued, well, one of the reasons that Hamas launched this attack on October 7th is because you had this Israeli-Saudi normalization deal that was coming close, right? President Biden was seemingly shepherding it through. And as we can talk about in the Q&A, it actually seemed like the US was making more concessions maybe than the Israelis were to the Saudis, because Mohammed bin Salman was asking for US security guarantees, a domestic nuclear program, et cetera, et cetera. It seemed like President Biden was willing to make this happen, perhaps for domestic reasons, perhaps because he wanted the Saudis out of China's orbit. But long and short, it was getting pretty close that there was going to be a deal between the Israelis and the Saudis, and then this attack happened. And some of the logic would be, well, guess what? As you've seen, this type of conflict, especially when Israel's doing the extent of violence they are inside of Gaza, it inflames public opinion across the Middle East, not just in Saudi, but elsewhere. And so it makes it very difficult for any Arab leader to talk with the Israelis, let alone make a deal to make peace with them amidst a conflict like this. So I think that there is some possible truth to this, but I actually think this is very oversold in international media and the punditry I've seen, in part because I don't think the timing matches up. The Saudi-Israeli normalization deal really was becoming a hot issue the past few months, whereas from what I've seen so far from intelligence and otherwise, this attack was planned starting over a year ago. So I do think that if we talk about what I have the picture here on the right, the Abraham Accords, where Israel did sign deals with Bahrain, United Arab Emirates, and others, that certainly Hamas does not want that to happen. Certainly one of their patrons, Iran, doesn't want this to happen. But I actually don't think this is the main strategy that Hamas was following here. There's others I think that are more important. One of them is what we call provocation. If we think about it, what Hamas was trying to do, and again, they call this series of attacks the Al-Aqsa Flood, is that they are trying to provoke the Israelis, not just in terms of getting Israel to come back and attack them, but also to then mobilize the Palestinian public as well as some of their allies to then attack Israel. So in the bottom left-hand corner, you can see someone waving this flag here. This is actually being waved in Tehran by Martyr Square, but in a broad sense, you see the Iranian flag, then you see the Palestinian flag, then you see, actually, this is the Syrian flag in the bottom left, and then the flag of Hezbollah, this armed group and political party inside of Lebanon. And the way that Hamas sees themselves as part of this quote-unquote axis of resistance alongside Iran and some of these other proxy groups. And so one of the reasons that Hamas wanted to launch this attack was they knew that Israel wasn't going to take this lying down. But whether it was bombing of cities like you see in Gaza here on the right, or Hamas is trying to hold territory and have Israel come and attack them, they felt like that would then mobilize more Palestinians to their cause. Hezbollah would potentially start a northern front against Israel. Iran would maybe get more directly involved, the Houthis in Yemen. And this was part of their strategy to then put the pressure on Israel and kind of change the dynamic in the conflict. So I absolutely think this was one of Hamas's key strategies. A third one that I think is talked about a lot less, but is to me maybe the most important one. And one of the reasons it's talked about less is because, again, it's not dealing with kind of the West and the US, and also leaders don't admit this stuff. When I wrote my first book, in which I interviewed members of the Palestinian National Movement, members of the Zionist movement, both groups and militias when they were fighting for a state, they would always say, hey, these other groups, they're constantly trying to outbid us for leadership. They're constantly trying to take over and become the leading group inside of our movement. But we're not trying to do that. We're just focused on the broader cause. The real truth is these organizations care about their own strength and survival, often much more than they care about the broader political cause that they ascribe to themselves. So in this broad sense, who is Hamas competing with? Hamas is competing with Fatah and the Palestinian Authority. Even though Hamas won the last elections the Palestinians had in 2006, they were not allowed to take over the Palestinian Authority, both by Israel and by the US, because they didn't sign on to the Oslo Accords recognizing Israel as well as a number of other things. So when you see Ismail Haniyeh with Mahmoud Abbas, this guy right here is the current president of the Palestinian Authority. Now he's 88 years old. Many people think he's going to potentially pass away pretty soon, and there's going to be a huge leadership struggle. Hamas is getting ready for that. This is, a political cartoon here where in Arabic it says Fatah Hamas. It shows these guys, hey, potentially at various points we're side by side, but really we're thinking about potentially, icing the other guy or at least becoming the leader above the other one as our subordinate group. The reason that Hamas's actions can potentially propel them to become a broader leader in the movement is that, number one, they're not just getting out of this Israeli provocation, although that certainly does matter. It leads to what we call a rally round the flag effect. When your community is struck by violence, there's often support for whoever the leader is or whoever is seen as the target of that. The biggest example of this is 9/11, right? Remember, George W. Bush had over a 90% approval rating in the days after 9/11. From Hamas's perspective, actually having this attack happen, Israel respond, that will lead to a surge in support for them. So that's number one. Number two, what else is Hamas getting out of this? Prisoner release, right? So Hamas has hundreds of Israeli hostages that they took on October 7th. As you've seen, they're trading them back at a rate of about 3-to-1, where they're getting about 3 Palestinian prisoners released for every 1 hostages that they exchange. So when these Israeli prisoners, these Palestinian prisoners come back, you can see that they're often welcomed by huge crowds in Palestinian cities. So even people who don't support Hamas, and not all the people being released are members of Hamas, are grateful to or happy about these prisoners being released. And so that's helping Hamas's political strength, especially because the Palestinian Authority is seen by most Palestinians as kind of a subcontractor for the Israeli military occupation of the West Bank. So Hamas is doing all of this, again, not just to provoke Israelis, but also to outbid and become stronger and get greater support within the Palestinian national movement. This is really important to understand because there happened to be a poll done in Gaza the day or two before the October 7th attack. It's totally unbeknownst to anybody. So this is an Arab barometer. And if you're looking for a great way to understand public opinion in the Middle East, you can go online, just type in Arab barometer, and it's the top level kind of public opinion polls that's done every 3-4 years by scholars at Princeton and a number of other universities, at University of Michigan. And they happen to poll Gazans the day or two before October 7th, and they ask them this question: how much trust do you have in the Hamas-led government in Gaza? And you look at this, and it's fascinating. The vast majority have no trust or not a lot of trust in Hamas. Very, very small percentage say they really trust Hamas. So the idea that, again, especially before October 7th, most Palestinians are supporting Hamas, or even the ones in Gaza really like Hamas, not the case at all. So one of the reasons, again, Hamas is using this violence is because they want to change the dynamic. They're looking around and saying, yeah, our governance isn't going so well. We're not really delivering that well to the people. We're not that popular, particularly among our population in Gaza. But guess what? This is a poll that was just done a week or two ago, and it asked a whole range of things. So this was a poll, again, you can find this online. It's the Arab World for Research and Development. It's an institute that's affiliated with Birzeit University, which is a great Palestinian university on the West Bank. And they surveyed Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza about a whole range of things. First, just looking to the right, of the people they surveyed in Gaza, 48% of them said that their home was completely or partially demolished. So again, significant number of people have had this type of impact. And 14% of them saying at least one immediate relative have been killed of the, almost 20,000 now who have been killed in Gaza. One of the results of this that you see is, look over here to the left. People were asked about every single one of these actors and basically what their opinion is, kind of like a temperature slider, where the higher the percentage, the more people kind of like that person. So it's like, oh, I'm like 90% approval rating versus, 1 or 5%. The Al-Qassam brigades is the Hamas military wing. So you can say, not incorrectly, that do people in Gaza right now fully feel the ability to faithfully and correctly answer a political opinion poll? Maybe not. But I also don't think that this is entirely wrong in terms of reflecting their public opinion. So what happens? Before the conflict, before Hamas launches this attack, they don't have a lot of trust in Gaza from the Palestinian people. After this attack, particularly after you have the Israeli response, what do you see? The groups that have the most approval are Hamas's armed wing, Islamic Jihad, an even more extreme group that's tied to Iran, the Al-Aqsa brigades, another armed group, Hamas more broadly, and then if we go down the list, US, Israel, UAE, these other parties that have potentially normalized with the Israelis have very, very low approval and support. So again, from Hamas's perspective, this at least is something that's maybe shown some returns for them so far, unfortunately, in terms of changing the dynamic and maybe alienating or at least polarizing some of their population. Another part of Hamas's strategy, attrition. Even though, again, this may be faulty, and I don't think that they're going to be successful at all at driving Israelis out of the country, one of the reasons that they wanted to take territory around Gaza and have large amounts of killing, etc., is that they are trying to make it unpalatable for Israeli Jews in particular to live in this territory. From their perspective, Palestine is a waqf, an Islamic trust that can't or shouldn't be negotiated over. They see most Israeli Jews as people who have come in as settlers or otherwise, so they want to drive them out. How do you do that? You raise the cost. You raise the cost in human cost. You raise the cost in economic cost, in PTSD, etc., which you see in some of the areas around Gaza from children and others who have to deal with constant rocket fire. And so this is part of Hamas's strategy, right? Basically make it so a war of attrition leads to the other side, or at least some of its people, giving in, and ultimately you're able to take control as a result of that. The final piece I'll say on Hamas, and then we'll switch over to the Israeli side, is that, again, Hamas's name for this attack or series of attacks was called the Al-Aqsa Flood. For those of you who don't know, this is a picture of what Muslims consider to be the Al-Aqsa compound. So again, according to the Jewish faith, this area down here is called the Western Wall. But what used to be up here was the first and second Jewish temple. And most Israeli Jews believe the second temple was right around here, destroyed by the Romans 2,000 years ago. And again, I could give you a whole background talk on that if you like. But the long and short you need to understand is that this area here is the holiest site in the world for Jews. This up here is the third holiest site in the world for Muslims. You have the Dome of the Rock, which again is built as a mosque today. It's on top of the place where Jews believe God put his finger down to start to create the world. It was where Abraham was going to sacrifice his son Isaac until he was held back at the last moment. And then you also have the Al-Aqsa Mosque. In Arabic, Al-Aqsa means the furthest mosque. And this is where Muslims believe that Muhammad did a midnight ride to then communicate with God, as well as the number of the prophets, etc. And so that's why this is the third holiest site in Islam. For Hamas, they consider this to be their core. If you look at, again, this is the symbols. This is Hamas's iconography. This one here is the regular group. This is the broader armed group, the Izz-al-Din al-Qassam brigades. Both of them have a picture, as you can see, of the Dome of the Rock there, which they want to, liberate in their perspective. One of the other things that's gone on the past couple of years is that you have this guy, Itamar Ben-Gvir, the Israeli national security minister, as well as a growing number of national religious Israeli Jews who not only go up to that site, but they also try to pray at that site. And this is a big flashpoint now between Israelis and Palestinians and between Muslims and Jews there, because the status quo that Israel itself has maintained since '67 is everyone can go and visit up here where the Second Temple used to be and where the mosques are, but only Muslims can pray. The idea is that if you're Jewish or in the faith, you can go down and pray here down below at the Western Wall, but you are not able to ultimately go in and go up to the mosque and pray there unless you are Muslim. And so this is being challenged, particularly by some Israeli politicians on the right. And so there's been some challenges to that since then. Okay, what about Israeli strategy and perspectives here? So one of the first things that's important to understand if you're looking at the context for October 7th and the years leading up to it is that the Israeli right has been ascendant and probably will be ascendant in the country for quite a while. If you want to look at this as a trend, you can look at this graph here, where up until the 60s, but honestly, this is since 1948, when Israel was founded, the labor Zionists dominated, right? The political left, strong ties into the Histadrut and the labor unions, believed in strong kind of state-controlled economy, etc. And you can see they dominated Israel for the first 3 or 4 decades of the country. But especially when we start to see the Second Intifada, the collapse of some of the peace process, increasing suicide bombings by groups like Hamas, that really starts to destroy a lot of the Israeli peace camp and the Israeli left, and you see the right become much more ascendant. And so that's one of the reasons that Benjamin Netanyahu recently became the longest serving prime minister in Israeli history, longer than David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister. So that's one of the reasons. Another thing is, and social scientists did some analysis of this, you can see a map of Israel here. Don't worry about every single one, but just look in the basic colors, which is the dark blue and the red. Red is support for left-wing party. Dark is support for Likud, Netanyahu's more right-wing party. And what people have found is that if you look at the communities that are the closest to Gaza, the ones that are in range more commonly of rocket fire, etc., they vote 2 to 6% more for the right-wing parties than those who are not in the same range or being hit by rockets. And again, you might say, hey, 2 to 6%, it's not that much. But if you've been following Israeli elections, just like in the US, Israel had 5 elections in 4 years because the elections were so close, just a little bit here, just a little bit there, of who was going to become prime minister or lead the country. So that's a significant impact. And again, just like for Palestinians, when you see violence into Gaza, that might push more support for the Palestinian right, like Hamas. Same happens in Israel. When you have violence from Hamas going into Israel, you get Israelis who shift a bit to the right. And it's not just, again, adults here. In fact, this is very different from almost any country in the world. You look at the US, you look in Europe, etc. Usually the youngest people are the most left-wing. Not the case in Israel. In Israel, 18 to 24-year-olds in a recent poll, 73% of them identified as right-wing. Now, some of that goes with demographics, where a disproportionate number of them are increasingly coming from ultra-Orthodox and national religious communities, but that's not the entirety of it. And so if we want to think about, talking about Israel today or Israeli strategy, that's increasingly been the strategy of Israeli right-wing parties. And in fact, the current government in Israel is the most right-wing Israeli government that they've ever had as a country. So important to understand that context. Now, what has been Israel's strategy leading up to October 7th regarding Gaza? The term that Israelis use is mowing the grass. Now, what does that exactly mean? And what's the logic of that? And again, there's an article if you want to read about it. Ephraim Inbar, Israeli scholar who's based in Bar Ilan, big in the Sadat Institute for Strategic Studies for a while. But again, there's been a bunch of articles on this. But the idea is basically this. When you go to Israel, especially if you talk to folks on the Israeli right, but not just on the Israeli right, they will say, hey, you Americans, you think everything has a solution. You always come in here with, what about the two-state solution? What about this? For many Israelis, they say, at least for right now, this is an intractable conflict. It's not going to be solved. So what we want to do is just manage it. What does managing it mean? Try to make it so we have a little bit more peace and calm for longer periods of time, recognizing that there's going to be rounds of violence that are going to happen. And so Israel's strategy with Gaza was basically, we don't want it to be a Palestinian state. We're not really ready or think we can necessarily destroy Hamas. And so what we're going to do is every couple of years, we're going to go in, or maybe even every couple of months sometimes, and try to degrade Hamas's ability to commit violence against us. Try to take out their missile sites, try to establish or reestablish deterrence, the idea that it's not worth it for Hamas or Islamic Jihad to launch attacks against Israel because they will have much more severe attacks than launched against them by the Israeli military, which is much stronger. And so that was the strategy for most Israelis leading up to October 7th, was saying, hey, mow the grass in Gaza. There's not a great solution for it, but this is kind of how we manage the conflict, even if we don't solve it. Now, critics of this strategy would say, hey, this is setting you up for, as I say here, tactical victories, but strategic defeats, right? The idea that maybe tactically you win the exchange with Hamas or you reestablish deterrence, but if there's no longer term strategy here, you're just going to keep having the same cycle again and again, which, to be fair, some of the supporters of mowing the grass would say, yes, that's the premise of why we're doing this, because we can't see a strategic outcome here that's possible. But again, this was a lot of the kind of status quo strategy for Israelis leading up to October 7th. The other key thing that particularly the Netanyahu administration did is what I call here kind of like divide and rule, shunning Abbas and engaging Hamas. And again, this might be counterintuitive to you, because if you know anything about Mahmoud Abbas, and again, far from a perfect guy, has probably 10 or 15% approval rating from Palestinians. He sends some stuff regarding the Holocaust, which is important. But in terms of his actual strategy and approach to Israeli-Palestinian negotiations, he's one of the most moderate Palestinian leaders that has ever existed. He actually denounced the suicide bombings by Hamas and others during the Second Intifada and said to Palestinians, like, this is not the way. He has pushed for negotiations with the US and the Israelis over the past decade plus and has not been supporting and pushing for, violence or otherwise. In part because of that, though, Benjamin Netanyahu ultimately does not want to have a Palestinian state. And so he actually usually would shun Mahmoud Abbas, not really talk to him. His government has defunded the Palestinian Authority. They've stopped giving taxes to it, et cetera, tax revenue to it. And instead, the past couple of years, they've actually been engaging with Hamas. They allowed the Qataris to send hundreds of millions of dollars to Hamas in Gaza to kind of rebuild some stuff economically. They've increased, as you see here in the upper right, the number of permits that Gazans had to be able to go work in Israel and then kind of come back later on. And again, the strategy right from Netanyahu's mouth for this was right here. Whoever's against a Palestinian state should be for transferring funds to Gaza, because maintaining a separation between the PA and the West Bank and Hamas and Gaza helps prevent the establishment of a Palestinian state. But again, what you see in places like the Times of Israel in recent days is to say, well, Netanyahu's strategy failed because he said to the Israeli people, look, I can contain Hamas, I can deter Hamas, we can deal with Hamas transactionally. Doing so will separate them from the PA and the West Bank, which will deny the Palestinians the ability to have a state, and we will be able to have relative calm in terms of violence. That was basically his strategy and what he was selling to the Israeli people. One of the things I'll say is that, and I'm not surprised by this, he didn't read my first book, because my first book, which is all about which national movements achieve states and which ones use violence or when groups use violence or not, answered this exact question. In fact, I studied the history of the Zionist movement and why they were able to successfully get the state of Israel, and the Palestinian national movement and why they've been unsuccessful achieving the state of Palestine, as well as the use of violence or nonviolence among those different groups and movements over time. And my key finding is simply this. If you have a fragmented movement with multiple different armed groups or parties that are competing, yes, Netanyahu is correct. They are less likely to achieve victory, in this case, a Palestinian state. But if you are fragmented among multiple groups, they are more likely to escalate violence because they're outbidding with each other. Like I said before, they're spoiling each other's peace deals. They're trying to provoke and get the other involved in a conflict, etc. Whereas on the other side, if you have what I call a hegemonic movement with one dominant party, like the Zionists before 1948, where the labor Zionists and the Haganah dominated, they're much more likely to restrain violence. In fact, the Haganah's strategy during certain periods was called havlaga, which in Hebrew means restraint. And then ultimately, they're more likely to have a cohesive push to achieve victory, which is what the Zionist movement did. So in many ways, what Netanyahu is trying to do here is to have his cake and eat it too. Simultaneously prevent the emergence of a Palestinian state, but also prevent all violence and grievance coming from Palestinians. And it's very tough to square that circle. And so ultimately, again, in some ways, we see what happened on October 7th. And if you look at the history of the Palestinian national movement, this is just my schematic of my own based on the strength of these different groups over time. The most escalatory period, if some of you remember in the 60s or 70s when there were airplane hijackings and bombings in office buildings, etc., that's when you had multiple different Palestinian factions that were competing. Then when you had negotiations with the Israelis at Oslo, it was in this time period where Fatah dominated the movement and didn't have a significant challenger. And then it becomes the most violent again when Hamas rises in the 2000s, and that's when we have the Second Intifada, competing suicide bombings, etc. What do Israelis think about all of this stuff? Well, let me show you. First on the right, the percentage of Israelis who put trust in Netanyahu right now is 4%. Yes, 4%, which is unbelievable because, again, this is a guy who is now the longest serving prime minister in Israeli history. He's currently leading the government. And yet, people in the center and the left have been pretty skeptical and upset with him for quite a while now, in part because of Supreme Court reforms, etc. But even on the right, his support has collapsed because, again, this deal that he sold to most Israelis on I can contain, deter, etc. Hamas blew up in the deadliest day in Israeli history. So personally and politically, he's in a really tough spot. And if and when new elections are called or this conflict ends, the likelihood of him remaining in office is quite low. But the other thing I want to point out here for some polls for Israelis is this. If you ask Israelis, and particularly the blue here is Israeli Jews versus Israeli Arabs or Palestinian citizens of Israel, which is in green. If you ask them, what are the goals that you support here? You can see almost all Israeli Jews say, we want to topple Hamas, we want to release the hostages, we want to restore deterrence, we want to distance Gaza and create a buffer zone. But then if you ask people to make choices and you say, okay, Israelis, which of these is your most important goal? the hostages comes away far and away number one. Toppling Hamas number two, then restoring deterrence, and then creating the buffer zone. So it's a really important thing, right? When we think about this conflict, so much of the focus seems to be again and again in terms of the military side, okay, destroying Hamas, etc. But for the Israeli people, the number one thing they care about is, bringing the hostages home, which gets as much or more coverage on Israeli news as does the actual conflict and the bombings in Gaza. Okay, what about U.S. policy and perspectives here? How does the U.S. play into all of this? First thing I'll say just as context is what's the most fascinating of the past few years, potentially in a negative way, is that this is the first time we've had kind of the ongoing Israeli-Palestinian conflict without any semblance of a peace process. If you remember, President Trump, President Obama, President Bush, President Clinton, you can keep going back, going back to Reagan, there's always been shuttle diplomacy and presidents visiting and summits and these types of things. Now, people can and do rightly criticize that about, hey, that didn't really work very well, or they never were able to get a deal, etc. But I will say that what's somewhat unique about the Biden administration, and a little bit at the end of the Trump administration, is how little effort and time U.S. presidents in recent years have put into this conflict. It's either because they feel like it's not solvable right now, or they'll say that the two parties have to want to solve it more than the United States does, or at the end of the day, they don't get along very well with the current leadership on one or both sides. But long and short, this is one of the most fascinating parts of all of this, is that this conflict is happening. And to be honest, what the Biden administration wants to do, and has wanted to for a while, and so did the Trump administration, by the way, pivot to Asia, right? The real focus is China and the rise of a great power rival like that. Whereas, again, things happen in the Middle East and they keep drawing the United States back in. George W. Bush came to office saying, I don't want to do nation building. I don't want to be involved in foreign wars like this. And then we have Iraq and Afghanistan, right? So the Middle East just has a way of drawing you back in, but it's potentially drawing the U.S. back in with no ongoing process at all to speak of to kind of build off of. So that's important context to understand. You probably have seen some of this on the news, but one of the other most fascinating things that, again, was going on before October 7th, and let's look at the poll down here to start out with, is that Israel used to be a bipartisan issue in the United States. What I mean by that is Democrats, Republicans, strong support for Israel vis-a-vis the Palestinians or kind of the broader Arab world. In recent years, particularly the past decade or so, like many things in our country, it has become polarized, where you still have pretty consistent, strong support for Israel among the Republican Party. But in the Democratic Party, you can see in 2023, for the very first time in the history of Gallup doing this poll, you had more Democrats who empathize and sympathize with Palestinians than they did Israelis. And so that's some of what President Biden is dealing with right now. He's in many ways part of some of the old guard in the Democratic Party who's very pro-Israel. He's been very pro-Israel throughout this conflict. But as you can see, it's not just, Rashida Tlaib or some of the other, younger members of Congress. It's also a lot of staffers and people who are doing protests, et cetera, who are saying, hey, I can't believe that Biden is being as supportive and one-sided in this conflict as he is, because for me, me as a progressive young Democratic voter, I feel like that shouldn't be the case, that either I'm more sympathetic with Palestinians or I want more of kind of a balanced perspective. And you can see how some of this goes back and forth. So right after the October 7th attacks, you actually had more Democrats that were sympathizing with Israelis, perhaps not surprisingly, right? So when you have something like that happen, you get more support on the Israeli side. But in more recent weeks, this is just a week or so ago, Quinnipiac did a poll, found that again, we're back to more Democrats sympathizing with Palestinians than with Israelis. And this has a real impact, right? Because I think if and when we have another Democratic president, I think that that person's sympathies or policy may not mirror that of President Biden. And so we could start to see this shift where you have Democratic, Republican president not being this kind of constant support as it's been for the past few decades. If you look at how Israelis think about this stuff, because again, there was a quote from Secretary of State Blinken recently, where the Israelis released to him basically their plans, which was to probably be doing violence and invasion in Gaza for at least the next couple months. And Blinken said, quote, you don't have that much credit, which basically means that, like has happened in the past, US support for Israel is there. But whether it's the 56 war, the 67 war, the 73 war, et cetera, there's an expiration date. The U.S. will not support Israel in terms of its, attacks or otherwise, ad infinitum. And so I think the Biden administration will probably put more and more pressure on the Israelis to go towards a ceasefire, especially in the coming weeks. And so you can look among Israelis how they feel about this. If that happens, the left and the center say act in coordination with the Americans, but on the right, majority say act only in accordance with the judgment of Israel's leadership. So again, you can see some divide there, somewhat on partisan lines among Israelis. Okay, last thing I want to talk about, and then I'm happy to take questions on any of this stuff, which is what potentially comes next in Gaza. This is a humanitarian tragedy, wherever you lay the blame of it or apportion the blame among it. But let's think about what could come next here. And the first thing I'll say, and actually this is what my current book project is I'm writing a book that's called To Which Victor Go the Spoils, and it's all about which groups take power after regime change. And one of the first things I find is, hey, guess what? States are horrible at this. It's in fact one of the reasons I'm writing this book. Again, just looking across the US, across administrations, whether it's the Bush administration thinking Ahmed Chalabi was going to win in Iraq and then his party didn't get a seat in the first Iraqi elections, or former President Obama saying Libya was his greatest mistake because they thought Ahmed Jibril was going to run the country, and then Libya spread into 3 different governments. Whether it was US CIA cables back in the 70s saying that, look, the Shah may fall, but Ayatollah Khomeini will never be able to take over the country, totally wrong. Whether it's the longest war in US history in Afghanistan that led to the Taliban coming back to power, you can see even the world's strongest power is not very good at predicting or affecting what comes next in the day after. And guess what? Israelis don't think their government has a plan either. People were asked, Jews, Arabs, left, right, center, etc. Does the government currently have a clear plan of action for the day after the end of the fighting in Gaza? Literally every single group, a majority says certain or think it does not have a clear plan. So Israelis don't think that their own government has a clear plan here. Yes, they think the government wants to destroy Hamas, get the hostages back, but what comes next? Well, let's at least talk through some of the scenarios here and understand, again, this is not just a strategic decision, this is very political. There is a huge kind of lurking elephant in the room here, which is who is responsible for October 7th? Not who's responsible in terms of carrying out the attack, like Hamas is responsible for carrying out the attack, but among the Israelis, who is responsible for kind of letting the guard down or not anticipating this stuff? And you may have seen intelligence leak out in recent weeks where there were actually members of Israel's high-level intelligence service, Unit 8200, who were saying Hamas is drilling to attack surrounding kibbutzim, etc. They were poo-pooed, and people were saying, look, that's not what's going to happen. So there's been some back and forth between political and military leaders about who's responsible, but a lot of that will come later. So what could happen? Okay, let me go from starting with things that I don't think will happen to maybe things that could happen. The first is annexation, right? Israel could decide, you know what? We could just annex the Gaza Strip, like Israel has annexed the Golan Heights, territory conquered from Syria in the 67 war, or East Jerusalem, conquered from Jordan in the 67 war. I don't see that as very likely because, again, those territories have strategic location, key water resources, major political and religious significance, demographics where Israel can annex the territory without getting massive Palestinian populations as part of Israeli citizenship. Gaza is the opposite on almost all of those, right? Gaza is a place where people have a hard time getting water resources. There aren't major religious sites there for Israeli Jews. Demographically, it's over 2 million Palestinians and no Israeli Jews. So the idea that Israel would want to annex that territory, I think, is very unlikely. What about resettlement? There used to be 8,000 Israeli Jewish settlers who lived in Gaza, but Israel pulled them out in 2005. Although there's some on the national religious right who would like to go back in there, I don't think even Netanyahu and other kind of more center or right-wing leaders want to do this. So I don't think Israeli Jewish resettlement of Gaza is that likely, even though, again, it's something you may see talked about in the press a little bit, particularly in certain communities. Okay, expulsion. This has happened before, especially back in the 48 war, whether it was in Lydda or Deir Yassin. You had Palestinian populations that were, physically removed from the areas that they were living, in this case in the context of the 48 conflict. I don't see this in the sense that both because of Israeli leaders and populations kind of, feelings of morality, as well as the international backlash that would happen, I don't see the Israeli government physically expelling Palestinians from Gaza. That being said, I do think, particularly on the Israeli right, that there's support for having fewer Palestinians in Gaza. So how could that happen? As you can see, they've tried to push Egypt or others to accept Palestinian refugees, maybe temporarily, but maybe permanently. And so even though I don't see this as that likely of a scenario, I think there is such anger and outrage among some Israelis that they want to have fewer Palestinians in Gaza, or at least closer to the border. And so I don't think full expulsion is anything possible that would happen. But I do think there's some discussion about ways of having fewer Palestinians there. And I think that's part of the discussion in Israel right now, even though I don't think it's the main scenario. I think some of these other ones are getting a little bit more likely. So the buffer zone. When Israel invaded Lebanon during the Lebanese Civil War in 1982, in the aftermath of their kind of semi-withdrawal, they established this buffer zone where they partnered with some local Lebanese armed forces to kind of create a buffer between northern Israel and then some of the factions or others that disliked them in Lebanon. I see this as possible in the sense that if you've looked at the destruction that Israel has had in northern Gaza, they've basically leveled Gaza City to the point that it's not going to be habitable for a while. So I think this is part of Israel's military thinking. But I think the possibility of Israel getting any type of favorable Palestinian group to coordinate with it in Gaza against some of the local population or Hamas, it would be, fanciful. That's not going to happen. So I don't think a buffer zone like happened in southern Lebanon can happen, even though I do think that the Israeli military will probably do some different construction of border walls and maybe move some of the population or buildings away from the border to the extent that they can. Okay, now we're getting to things that I think are more possible, kind of direct or mixed occupation. Basically, Israel controls militarily the West Bank. It has over 500,000 Israeli Jewish settlers who live there, as well as deployment of large numbers of Israeli military. In fact, it's in many ways kind of the main focus, particularly for the Israeli right that wants to have territorial expansion. One of the reasons, again, this will come up later, but one of the reasons there was less defense around Gaza on October 7th is that a few Israeli brigades had been tasked to go to the West Bank because there was renewed fighting between some of the settlers there and the local Palestinian population. So it is very possible that Israel's invasion into Gaza is not something that's going to end in a week or two or a month or two or otherwise, and that they're going to have some degree of military control of the territory for a while into the future. Now, they've talked about, hey, maybe you could have the PA be in there, maybe you could have some Arab state, etc. As of now, Netanyahu himself is saying we're not going to have the PA in part because it's a lot of the people in his coalition don't like the PA, as I mentioned before. But who exactly would then take over? I don't see any Arab state wanting to send any significant force in there, or the UN or otherwise. So I think, honestly, Israel's going to kind of own Gaza for a while, at least as long as it's there. And it's going to be some type of military occupation in the territory, at least for a bit. Now, they may decide either in southern Gaza or more broadly that despite the fact that most Israelis think the mowing the grass strategy has failed, that's still something they can try to maintain, which is, hey, if we can't fully destroy Hamas, we can still kind of constantly degrade them and try to reestablish deterrence in such a way that they won't try to do something like this again. But again, to me, this would be something they would do if they couldn't achieve some of the other objectives they want, which is try to, destroy or replace Hamas. And one of the final things I wanted to raise as a scenario is it's not out of the realm of possibility that Hamas remains in power. Hamas is not going to be destroyed as an entity. They have, members and leaders outside of Gaza. So Israel, I think, is going to target some of them, whether it's around the Arab world, etc. But they're not going to go away as a group. As you've seen, if anything, their support has risen. It doesn't mean they're going to remain in power in Gaza. Israel can potentially prevent them from realistically, running the area. But it's not impossible. In 2006, Israel said with the war in Lebanon, we're going to destroy Hezbollah. Just like they said now, we're going to destroy Hamas. And Hezbollah is to be more powerful than it's ever been, and certainly is more powerful than it was in 2006. So even though these are the goals that Israel sets out to achieve, it doesn't mean it's the easiest thing to achieve, particularly in the challenging scenario that Gaza presents. If all of these seem to you like not great choices or great next steps, I think you're right. And again, one of the reasons I think that's the case is because you have groups on both sides. You have Hamas, who launched these horrific attacks on October 7th, and you have the current leadership under Netanyahu, who one of the reasons that they came to power is they spoiled previous peace deals because they both sold to their people that they can kind of have a full victory against the other side. So anything that is not that is going to be difficult and it's not going to look like some kind of peaceful compromise outcome. So if you've ever heard these terms before, like one state, two state solution, in the 90s, what was being negotiated over was right here in the center. Okay, a two-state solution of an Israel alongside a new Palestinian state will negotiate about the borders and Jerusalem and refugees, etc. What you see in both camps now is more and more Israelis who are disillusioned with this, more and more Palestinians who are disillusioned with this, and so more and more Israelis who now want a one-state solution of just Israel, maybe with annexing some or all of the West Bank. And on the Palestinian side, like Hamas, wanting to have a one-state solution that's just Palestine, or maybe just a binational state, which most Israeli Jews would say is the destruction of Israel. So that's the time period we're in. It's not a hopeful one for kind of a broader peace deal that has some type of compromise, but it's important to kind of understand where we got here if we want to get to a different scenario. So to close, I just want to put out there, and I'm happy to send these slides to BJ and others. If you are looking for resources to read beyond US media, you don't have to read Hebrew or Arabic. These are a series of Israeli news sources, starting with a great polling site. Same on the Palestinian side, a great Palestinian polling site. And if you want to read what Israelis and Palestinians are reading and what they're thinking, these are great resources to check out. If you want to read books on the conflict and what's going on, this upper left one I'll push in particular, Arabs and Israelis, single best textbook on this stuff. written by Shai Feldman, Khalil Shakaki, and Abdulmunim Said Ali, an Israeli, a Palestinian, and an Egyptian. They co-wrote it. They talk about the facts of the history of the conflict, but also the community narratives about it. So really well done. And a bunch of others that are there as well. And then finally, if you're not a book person, but you're a documentary person, these are some great ones to check out. Unsettled is about the Israeli withdrawal from Gaza in 2005. Gatekeepers is interviewing all former members of the Israeli leadership of Shin Bet, their internal intelligence service, about these exact decisions about when do you strike a Hamas leader, how do you do it, or what would you do it if it would lead to civilian deaths, etc. And then from Palestinian perspective, Budros deals with Palestinian life in the West Bank, and the law in these parts deals with the Israeli legal system that was in that territory. So with that, I will stop. And again, look forward to your questions and comments. I know I covered a lot, but happy to talk about anything I did not raise. So thank you.
Yeah, very good. Thank you, Peter. Great insights there. I know everyone on the call appreciates it. And so I think with that, let's open it up for questions. I don't see the full screen. I guess if folks can raise their hand, that would be ideal. But in lieu of that, maybe we just open it up.
I had a question. How much credence would you put behind any like Russian interference aiding the Hamas effort, or is that total hogwash?
Yeah, I don't know if like I'd say hogwash, but I would say in terms of significance, very low. Hamas's vast majority of their funding, their support, their weaponry, their strategic thinking is not coming from Russia. Now, Russia certainly sees itself as a balancer to the U.S. regarding, you know, countries like Syria and Iran for sure, if we're talking about like nuclear negotiations or technology. But in terms of Hamas, Russia is not a major player there. So I wouldn't, I don't know the context of what you're raising that for, but I don't see them as a major issue either in this attack or in terms of the group's strategy going forward.
Peter, how about other groups? So obviously, it appears Iran is behind this in a big way. You see like the Houthi, the targeting the ships, today again, we see more of that. So is there a chance that this escalates, continues to escalate with some of the other players in the region?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. And yeah, as you kind of phrased there, I think we've already seen some escalation. But if we're thinking about the escalation ladder, there's 10 steps, maybe we've gone up 2 or 3 steps outside the region. But the concern is, do we go to 3, 4, 5, et cetera? Because yes, we've seen Houthi attempted missile strikes. We've seen, the taking over of Israeli affiliated ships. We've seen an increase in shots fired across the bow and in the north between Hezbollah and the Israeli military. So yeah, but we haven't seen, I guess, thankfully, escalating to kind of something like full-blown war with any of those groups. And again, I think that's to Hamas's detriment. They wanted to bring in all of these other parties to fight, and partially, I think, because of these groups' own interests, and partially because of both Israeli and American deterrence, they haven't done so. So again, I didn't raise this, but as some of you probably followed, the U.S. sent a second carrier battle group to the area, and that was done, yes, to support Israel, but a lot of it also to deter Hezbollah and to deter Iran, because the U.S. has a strong interest in preventing broader regional escalation of the conflict. So I think that if things kind of continue as they are, I don't see the likelihood of full-blown war with Hezbollah being that high, because again, I think Hezbollah has their own interest in all of the massive economic and political tragedies that are going on in Lebanon, and wants to maintain their strength there. So I think some of these groups are doing things to kind of show solidarity and take pot shots at Israel, but I'm not sure if they want to pay the political and military costs of getting fully involved. I also don't think Iran wants a direct war with Israel. But again, they do want to pressure the Israelis, and they would love to have their proxies do potentially a little bit more. So I think it's important to understand that context. The only other thing I'll say is that I don't think this is an attack that Iran told Hamas to carry out. Again, I don't fully know. We have to see behind the scenes stuff. Hamas absolutely gets significant funding from Iran and missile technology, et cetera. But I don't think this is something where Iran was pulling the strings and saying, carry this out, et cetera. I don't think the Iranians were sad to see this happen, but I think this was probably driven by Hamas's internal leadership, which is a final important point to understand. Hamas is not monolithic. One of the reasons that Netanyahu and Israelis, and honestly Americans, were surprised, National Security Jake Sullivan, I don't know if you've seen him on the news or otherwise, but he had a piece coming out in Foreign Affairs the week of October 7th that said, the Middle East has never been this quiet before. We've done X, Y, Z, and they actually allowed him to pull it and to change it to not be embarrassed by it. So this took a lot of people by surprise. And I think one of the reasons is that Hamas had seemed in recent years like it was willing to not deal to recognize Israel, but to do this transactional stuff and kind of keep things quiet. So I think that there is kind of an internal, external Hamas struggle going on here, which we've seen with armed groups before, whether the IRA or others, where those that are in Gaza are kind of more extreme and wanting to do this. Those who are more external, more willing to make political negotiations. But it seems here like the internal folks kind of maybe won out and launched this attack.
Hey, Peter, can you either verify or deny? There are different people's views in terms of Hamas is hiding under hospitals, hiding in well-populated areas with lots of families, lots of kids. And, it's interesting when I speak to my kids, sometimes they become sympathizers, right? Look, the Israelis are bombing these hospitals. They're doing some really bad things in these communities, right? There's a lot of, women and children dying as part of this conflict, right? So, can you kind of demystify a little bit? Is there truth to how Hamas, has behaved in terms of where it embeds itself, and kind of the realities of what we're hearing on the news channels?
With all due respect, are you really asking this question? I mean, I'm Peter, please answer.
Oh, I'm happy to take a follow-up question or your comment on it.
I'm shocked this question's being asked. I'm shocked. If
I don't mind if you say, Michael,
it's not overwhelming at this point, I don't know what is.
Okay, so I'll say a couple of things. So Hamas has a very extensive tunnel network in Gaza that's been built up over a series of years. And there's, I think, pretty good evidence that goes under, many areas in Gaza City and elsewhere, and certainly goes under some hospitals, some schools. And, Israel has had a number of different things that they've tried to show, here's where this stuff has been constructed. Now, a couple of things that you see on the news as well is that, how much it's kind of like a command center that's there versus there have, fighters there, et cetera. I think that that's maybe still up for some debate, but there's been some very interesting evidence. They showed cameras from inside of El Shifa Hospital where they were taking some of the hostages and some other things that were there. So I think that there's pretty good evidence that Hamas irrefutable evidence, I would say, that Hamas, bases some of itself and its fighters in civilian areas, that they base themselves in tunnels under civilian areas. And that, again, from their perspective, and it's very interesting, more than I've ever seen before, if you look at some of their leaders interviewed on Arab networks, they've been challenged on this, where you had some Arab commentators who said, why didn't you build one single bomb shelter for the Palestinian civilians, knowing that this was going to happen? So they've been challenged on this. And so I think it's irrefutable that Hamas has a tunnel system, that they base some of their rocket fire and their fighters from under there, that they put it under civilian targets without much care for them. And I think that that's true. I think that the challenge is, and why people still can be, upset by it, is that, you still have a high proportion of civilians that are killed in this conflict. Now, again, you can get into who you want to blame for that. You can blame Hamas for launching these attacks in the first place. You can blame Israel somewhat in terms of, how much it's attacking areas where it knows that, yes, we're going after Hamas leaders, but civilians are also going to be killed. If you want to see one of the best articles I've seen on this recently, I put it in the chat right now. I was honestly a little turned off by reading it by the title, because it seemed to me, okay, is this going to be kind of a slanted thing? 972 is actually an Israeli news organization, but they got really fascinating and to me seems credible interviews about something that is part of the conflict now, which is one of the things that Netanyahu and Israeli leadership said before this is that the gloves are going to be off because of the brutality of what happened, because over 1,200 Israelis were killed, because of there were rapes and killing of children, etc. That Israel's kind of regulations regarding what they were going to be accepting regarding civilian death among Palestinians is going to be looser than before. And I think there's been strong evidence for that. And so in this article, they talk about that. And basically you have Israeli members of intelligence and military and Air Force talking about, well, what is the standard that they need to have to like hit a building or something like that? And the standard used to be often, it was like, okay, you can't have above 5 civilians who are killed in this or something like that. And again, it depends on the value of the target. But a lot of times during the conflict now, it's something where if they can say there's a Hamas member that lives in that building, even if they're not like a member of the armed wing, that potentially it's then okay to like level the building, which can obviously, kill large numbers of people, as we've seen. Israel also would do what's called kind of door knocking or roof knocking, where they would do a smaller bomb on the roof of a building to let people know that that building was targeted, and then people would go out. They're not doing that as much now. And so you see a high proportion of civilians being killed here, even if, again, I don't think that most Israelis want to kill large numbers of Palestinian civilians, but I also do think it's true that they have some indifference to killing Palestinian civilians right now. And I think that article goes into it a bit.
BJ, I apologize for being so forceful, but it's beyond question, in my opinion, the tactics of Hamas. They have zero regard for Palestinian lives. And the suffering of Palestinian women and children is appalling. I feel for them terribly. I really do. But 100% of the guilt of this is on Hamas. The cynicism there is beyond, So Peter, a question for you. You've shown how Hamas has grown. Their popularity has spiked in the past month or so. Do you not think there's going to be a return to some normalcy where people in the Arab world will take a step back and say, what have Hamas actually done for Palestine? They've been ruling Gaza since 2006. The population of Gaza's Palestinian population has gone from 1.29 million to 2.02 million. Palestinians, have grown, and yet the services and the economic potential for Palestinians has been zero, because of 100% of the spending has gone on tunnels and missiles and to enrich the fat cats who run Hamas. I mean, when is the Arab world going to say, okay, that doesn't work, and we need to start thinking about our own people?
Sure, a couple of things. And also, Stephen, I saw your hand too, by the way, so I'm happy to take your question or comment next. So, Michael, a couple of things on your, I think, very important question. The first is I would disaggregate, the broader Arab world, and I didn't mean to imply otherwise. There's a number of Arab states who feel exactly what you're saying. It's like, take the Egyptian government, for example. The Egyptian government hates Hamas, not only because they see them as an outgrowth of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is they see as their public enemy number one, but also because they feel like Hamas hasn't been serving the Palestinian cause or the Palestinian people. So I think that there are both governments and people, again, just like that graph I showed you before, the majority of Palestinians in Gaza didn't have much trust in Hamas's government for exactly the reasons you mentioned, because they haven't delivered public goods and services and otherwise to the people. So the key is, are we in a conflict context or not? Because the more and the longer we have what's going on now lasts, the more popularity Hamas gets and the stronger it gets. The more there's more quiet and they have to govern, that's when their support generally goes down, because they don't generally govern effectively. And so that's why, if you're talking to me about what is the strategy that needs to be used here, yes, a military strategy needs to be used in the sense of going after the organization, the individuals who carry out this attack. But if Israel doesn't simultaneously have some type of political strategy to push for, if not some final deal, then some type of hope, both for their people and the Palestinian people, that the future can be different, then you're not going to have the building of that grassroots, not just opposition to Hamas, but supporting for something else. And again, you can look at support for the PA versus Hamas or Hamas versus other groups, and it's almost a perfect negative correlation with how the peace process is going. So to me, the decline and destruction of the peace process and the lack of any hope for anything else is what also fuels Hamas. And so ultimately they can be beaten and their support can go away. But the conflict has to not just be a ceasefire, there has to be something better that's offered. And then that's where Hamas's support will decline. Stephen, I saw your hand as well.
Peter, thank you. This has been great. And I know we've spent a lot of time here, and I know we don't have a lot of time left, but can you talk a little bit about U.S. policy vis-a-vis Iran? It seems like Iran is the real bad actor here, and that seems to be the root of all the problems here. Iran now having all this money from oil revenues, et cetera, et cetera. And, it seems to me like the policy of the Biden administration of sort of appeasing Iran versus trying to isolate Iran. Can you just comment on that a little bit? Because it seems like that seems to be the real problem. And we've decided to throw our lot in more with Iran than with Saudi, which probably is unfortunate.
Yeah, I don't know if I would agree with that last point, especially with how much Biden has been bending over backwards to try to bring Saudi in on the Israeli side, right? So I think that you're right that in the basic sense, the Saudi leadership and some others maybe like the Trump approach more, which was very anti-Iran and kind of in line with them and not questioning them on human rights, etc. Mohammed bin Salman really didn't like Biden, questioning him on Khashoggi and the assassination of, et cetera. But I think a couple of things. This is good news. Whether you had the kind of Trump administration policy of maximum pressure or the Biden administration policy of not no pressure, but significant but less pressure, but trying to renew the Iran nuclear deal in some form, I don't think either has been very successful in the sense that, neither has led to regime change in Iran or a major change in Iranian policy in a positive fashion. I guess I would say that the U.S. ability to impact Iranian policy or the government of Iran is far less than many Americans might want or hope. In terms of whether Biden's policies, kind of inspired Hamas, like I don't put honestly much credence in that. I don't think that Iran is sitting there and saying, oh, U.S. is doing maximum pressure, we're not going to do anything. I mean, when Trump was doing maximum pressure, Hezbollah and the Houthis and others were doing a lot of different things. The last round of this conflict we had with Hamas was in 2021 and then in 2019. So look, I think that Iran's a really tough nut to crack because you have to decide whether you want regime change or whether you can deal with a regime that, you consider to be a real problem. The Biden administration, like the Obama administration, decided to say, we don't like these guys. We're going to keep fighting and sanctioning them on a lot of things, but we want to prevent them from getting a nuclear weapon. And we feel like the best way to do that is to monitor and have agreements regarding their enrichment of uranium. The Trump administration disagreed and said, we don't want them to have a nuclear weapon either. We don't trust them about doing this at all. And so we're going to put pressure on them to prevent that. To me, neither of those is an indefensible policy. It comes down to what you think and how you think Iran can be prevented from either getting a nuclear weapon or, supporting more of these kind of escalatory axis of resistance acts in the region. I'll just tell you as a researcher, I haven't seen one or the other that's been a great success. They both kind of been failures, in my opinion.
Thank you.
Any additional questions out there? I can't see the show of hands. Well, we are at the bottom of the hour, and I guess we want to keep the time integrity here. So, Peter, thank you so much on behalf of Lumen. This has been absolutely fascinating, and we always like to end with a resolution in all of our Lumen meetings and sort of our takeaway, and you've given us some incredible information there. And I think the only thing that comes to my mind, my heart, is where Father Brandenburg started it with prayer, and that we just, as Lumen members, that we are very prayerful for an end to the human suffering, and prayerful for our Lord's peace in that region. And I think Father Brandenburg said it well. Our Lord must be so sad to see that in his homeland. So thank you again for being here. And as this goes on, maybe we can reach out in the future and get an update as things develop.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for having me. And again, if people have further questions or thoughts I didn't get to, my email's there in the chat. So you're welcome to drop me a line anytime. But all the best to you all this holiday, Christmas season. And pray for peace in the Holy Land.
Yeah, thank you. And if you could forward the presentation, that would be awesome. Yeah, fantastic.
Happy to send along the slides. Yes.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. Have a good evening.
Later.